The gentle sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over the rescue center. The quiet atmosphere was only broken by familiar sounds. The sounds of life, of fragile souls gradually recovering from the wounds the world had inflicted upon them. Evelyn Harper stood in the middle of the wide courtyard, taking a deep breath to fully embrace the rhythm of life unfolding around her. To her, this was not just a workplace. This was home, the place where she poured her heart into, the place where she witnessed the smallest yet most profound miracles. Every day, she and her colleagues fought to reclaim life for these vulnerable beings. Some days were smooth, but there were also days of exhaustion, days filled with tears and helplessness. She had seen too much suffering, tired eyes still clinging to hope, trembling figures seeking the slightest warmth from humans. And in those moments, she knew she could never stop. Evelyn did not see this as just a job. It was a mission. To her, every living creature deserved to be loved and respected just as much as any human. Each life held a story, a soul worthy of care and protection. She believed that if people could open their hearts to these beings, the world would become a better place. A soft smile formed on her lips as she sensed a tender gaze directed toward her. Moments like these, peaceful pauses amid the chaos of life, were the most precious to her. But just then, a gentle breeze swept through, carrying the echoes of a past she thought she had left behind. And though she had learned to be stronger, her heart could not help but tremble at the memory of one man, Johnny Depp. A year ago, Johnny Depp was a name known to everyone in the racing world. He wasn't the greatest racer of all time, but he was undoubtedly the most confident. To Johnny, life was painted in only two colors: speed and victory. There was no room for hesitation or failure. He didn't just love racing, he was addicted to the thrill of conquest, to the rush of surpassing every limit. The racetrack was where he proved himself, where he showed the world that he was above the rest. And his personal life was no different. Johnny had never encountered a challenge he couldn't overcome, especially when it came to women. They all shared one thing in common. They were drawn to his charisma, swept up in the intoxicating world of excitement and passion he offered. But soon enough, they faded into vague memories because Johnny had never truly let anyone into his heart. To him, love was a game, and he always won. That evening, beneath the dazzling lights of an extravagant party, everything unfolded as usual. Familiar faces, glasses of wine shimmering in the glow, laughter echoing through the grandeur of high society. Johnny lounged on the sofa, a whiskey glass in one hand, his eyes gleaming with self-assured amusement as he scanned the room, like a conqueror selecting his next target. Then Derek Vaughn, his closest friend, approached and tossed out a challenge. "Think you could make any woman fall for you in a month?" Johnny chuckled, setting down his whiskey, his interest piqued. "Derek, is that a serious question? I've never lost, and you know that." Derek smirked, eyes gleaming with mischief. "Then why not prove it?" Johnny raised an eyebrow, folding his arms across his chest. "And do you already have someone in mind?" Derek's grin widened as if he were about to drop a bomb that would shake Johnny's world. "I've already chosen Evelyn Harper." The name instantly shifted the atmosphere. The nearby guests paused, turning their attention toward Johnny with anticipation. He frowned. "Evelyn Harper? Who's that?" Derek chuckled, his gaze filled with intrigue. "A veterinarian. Works at an animal rescue center a few miles from here. And the most interesting part? She despises guys like you." Johnny laughed. "And why should I care?" "Because she's unlike anyone you've ever met." Derek's voice lowered, laced with challenge. "She doesn't believe in love, doesn't care about glamour, and most importantly, she absolutely hates reckless racers. If you can make her fall for you in a month, then that would be a real victory." Johnny remained silent for a few moments before slowly leaning back in his seat. A girl who didn't care about love, a woman who wasn't swayed by his charm. This challenge was more interesting than he had expected. "What's your bet?" Derek smirked. "One of your cars." Johnny raised an eyebrow. "Which one exactly?" "The Aston Martin you love so much." Johnny's voice dropped. "You're serious?" Derek nodded. "Either you win or you lose, just like on the racetrack." Johnny took a deep breath, then slowly smiled. All right, I'll make her fall for me. Cheers erupted, handshakes exchanged, amused laughter filled the air. But Johnny paid no attention. He had made up his mind, and he had never failed once he set a goal. The only problem was, he didn't realize that this time, he wasn't just betting a car. He was about to bet his own heart. An animal rescue center was no place for someone who thrived on speed and adrenaline. But Johnny Depp didn't think so. The next morning, he arrived with his usual flair. A sleek sports car, a meticulously tailored outfit, and a confident smile. He had no doubt that he could make Evelyn Harper notice him, even if only for a moment. As soon as he stepped inside, he took in his surroundings. People were busy working. No one even spared him a glance. The scent of antiseptics mixed with the presence of recovering animals. The hurried footsteps, the volunteers calling out to each other. This was not his world, but he could play the game. Evelyn was at the intake desk, intently writing something in the logbook. She didn't even look up when she heard his footsteps approaching. Johnny stopped in front of her, flashing his signature smile. "Good morning." No glance, no reaction. "What do you need?" Her voice was calm but distant, as if his presence was insignificant. Johnny raised an eyebrow. For the first time, he met a woman completely immune to his charm. That only intrigued him more. "I heard this is a great place to help animals. I'd like to learn more." Evelyn slowly looked up, studying him for a few seconds. There was no curiosity or interest in her gaze. "Do you have any experience with animals?" Johnny shrugged. "I had a pet goldfish, but it didn't live very long." She set her pen down, crossing her arms. "Do you think this is a joke?" Johnny raised his hand slightly as if proving his innocence. "Not at all. I genuinely want to help." Evelyn stared at him for a long moment, then lightly shook her head. "The animals here don't need pity or temporary curiosity. If you really want to help, prove it." Johnny blinked. This wasn't the response he had expected, but instead of feeling discouraged, he felt challenged. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he felt like he might lose. He came back the next day. This time, no expensive outfit, no flashy sports car. He brought a large donation, thinking it would help him gain access more easily. But Evelyn wasn't impressed. She took the check from his hand, glanced at the amount, then looked up. "You think money can buy sincerity?" Johnny hesitated for a second. She placed the check on the desk, not even bothering to put it away. "If you really want to help, do something more meaningful." He wasn't used to this feeling. People usually welcomed his donations, smiling gratefully, even admiring his generosity. But Evelyn looked at him as if he were nothing more than a passing stranger. Johnny smiled, trying to regain his composure. "Then how about I take you to dinner?" Just a friendly invitation. Evelyn didn't hesitate. "If I had free time, I'd spend it on animals that need me more." This time, Johnny had no response. He realized that his usual tactics wouldn't work with Evelyn. If he wanted to get closer, he had to truly understand her, to step into her world. He had never met someone like her, and that made it impossible for him to walk away. At first, Johnny thought integrating into the rescue center was just a step in his plan. But from the moment he set foot inside, he realized one thing. This world was not as easy as he had imagined. On his first day, he was assigned to clean enclosures and assist volunteers. His expensive shoes were soon covered in mud. His shirt lost its pristine appearance. He had never done this kind of work before, and clearly he wasn't good at it. Evelyn watched from a distance, saying nothing. He tried to follow instructions, but nothing came easily. He was constantly corrected, sometimes even having to redo everything from scratch. But Johnny didn't give up. The next day he came back, and the next day too. No one understood why a race car driver willingly threw himself into such exhausting work. But Johnny Depp didn't care. He was no longer trying to impress Evelyn. He genuinely wanted to understand her. She loved these animals in a way he had never seen before. The way she cared for them, the gentle way she comforted those fragile beings. Everything was so sincere that it made him stop and think. He started noticing the little things. She always overworked herself in silence, losing track of time. She rarely took breaks, but she always set aside a few moments to watch the animals that had been saved. And for the first time, Johnny found meaning in what he was doing. He was no longer an outsider. One day, the rescue team received a call about an animal in danger. Johnny had never been on an actual rescue mission before, but this time, he decided to go. It was the moment he truly faced fear. Not the fear of speed, not the risks of the racetrack, but the fear of losing a life right in front of him. For the first time, he felt the helplessness of standing before a fragile creature, unable to protect itself. Evelyn didn't panic, even though the situation was extremely tense. She simply gave orders to the rescue team, her gaze steady, her hands unwavering. Johnny watched her and realized he had never seen anyone so strong. When the mission ended, they returned to the center in silence. Johnny sat down on the steps, his body exhausted. Evelyn watched him for a long moment before unexpectedly placing a bottle of water in front of him. He looked up. "Good job," she said, her voice no longer as cold as before. Johnny felt something shift, not just between him and her, but within himself. Feelings don't come from promises, nor from power games. They come from change, from the little things we are willing to do for someone else. Johnny no longer thought about the bet. All he knew was that, for the first time in his life, he wanted to be better. Not to win, not to conquer, but because he didn't want to lose her. The peaceful days at the rescue center became the most beautiful time of Johnny's life. He no longer cared about the luxury he once lived in, no longer obsessed over the prestigious races he had once craved. His entire world now revolved around the rescue center, where he was beginning to understand the value of sincerity and the simplest of things. Evelyn, too, started to see him differently. She was no longer cold, no longer kept her distance whenever he appeared. They talked more, sharing quiet moments after long days of work. She still didn't fully trust him, but at least she no longer saw him as a stranger. Johnny felt himself getting closer. It was no longer a bet, no longer a game, but something real. And then one day, everything fell apart. Derek's text arrived late one afternoon. "So, have you won yet?" Johnny's phone buzzed at the exact moment Evelyn happened to walk into the office. She had no intention of reading his message, but her eyes skimmed over the screen and stopped, her heart clenched. "Have you won yet?" Everything shattered in an instant. Evelyn turned to Johnny, her eyes filled with hurt. He knew immediately what was happening, but it was too late. "Johnny," her voice trembled. "What is this?" He quickly grabbed his phone, but that only confirmed her worst suspicions. "It's not what you think," he tried to explain, but even he couldn't find the right words. Evelyn took a step back, her eyes turning cold. "So everything you did was just a game?" Johnny moved closer, but she immediately raised a hand to stop him. "Evelyn, just listen to me." "Listen to what?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Listen to you tell me that you were only here because of some stupid bet? That everything I believed in was just a lie?" Johnny had never seen her like this before. She didn't scream, didn't cry, but the pain in her eyes was so deep that it made him feel utterly despicable. He wanted to tell her that everything had changed, that yes, it had started as a bet, but now it was anything but that. But how could he expect her to believe him? "I thought that..." She paused as if swallowing back her emotions. "I thought you really cared, that you had changed." She shook her head and turned away. Johnny felt his world collapse. Evelyn didn't look back. For the first time in his life, Johnny knew what true loss felt like. Not losing a race, not losing a bet, but losing the one thing he truly wanted to keep. Evelyn had disappeared from his life. She didn't block him, didn't completely cut him off, but she no longer wanted to see him. Johnny drove aimlessly through the night, not knowing where he was going. The roads that once thrilled him now felt like an endless void. The roar of the engine no longer brought excitement. It only made his heart feel heavier. He hated this feeling. He hated the helplessness. Hated the fact that there was nothing he could do to change the outcome. But more than anything, he hated himself, because he had turned something precious into a joke. Johnny pulled over on the side of the road, staring at the steering wheel. He could go back to his old life. He could pretend that none of this had happened, that Evelyn was just a fleeting presence in his world. But he couldn't. For the first time, racing no longer mattered. Winning no longer meant anything. Johnny turned off the engine and sat in silence, letting the darkness consume him. The next day, he didn't show up on the racetrack. No one knew what was happening to Johnny Depp. His friends from the racing world called and texted, but he didn't respond. Derek tried reaching out, but Johnny didn't want to hear his voice. He didn't blame Derek. This was his fault. He spent the entire day thinking about Evelyn, about the time they had spent together, about what he had lost. But thinking wouldn't change anything. For the first time in his life, Johnny felt the need to do something. Not for himself, not to win, not to prove anything, but because he genuinely wanted to be better. Evelyn was gone, but he still went back to the rescue center. Not for her, but because he realized this place meant more to him than he had ever imagined. The first few days weren't easy. People looked at him with skepticism. Some whispered, others remained silent, but it was clear they no longer treated him the same way. Johnny didn't blame them. He just quietly continued working. He didn't know if he would ever earn Evelyn's trust back, but one thing was certain. He could no longer be the person he once was. He had to change, not to win her back, but to never lose something so precious again. The evening sun cast golden hues over the rescue center, bathing the rooftops and familiar courtyard in warm light. Johnny was still there, his hands covered in dirt, his clothes worn and ragged from days of continuous labor. He was no longer the charming man with a self-assured smile. He was simply someone trying to right his wrongs. No one looked at him with contempt anymore, but they didn't welcome him either. The volunteers still kept their distance. They knew about the bet. They knew Evelyn had been hurt because of him, and they weren't quick to forget. Neither was Evelyn. She still showed up every day, as dedicated as ever. But she never spoke to Johnny. Whenever he walked into a room, she quietly left. Whenever their eyes accidentally met, she turned away as if he didn't exist. At first, Johnny thought he wouldn't be able to endure it. But then, he realized that maybe this was exactly what he deserved. So he kept going. He no longer stayed at the center just to get Evelyn's attention. He stayed because he realized this place truly meant something to him. Because he wanted to do something that mattered more than just winning a race. He learned to care for fragile lives. He learned patience. He learned to put the needs of others before his own. And gradually, the people around him started to see him differently. Maybe Evelyn noticed that too. One late evening, as Johnny finished cleaning the enclosures, he heard soft footsteps behind him. Evelyn stood there, her expression unreadable, holding a glass of water. She said nothing, simply placed the glass beside him and walked away. Johnny watched her leave, his heart tightening. Maybe that was a sign. Johnny had never believed in fate or redemption, but there was one thing he was sure of. If he had a chance to make things right, he would take it. Evelyn had started talking to him again. Not much, not for long, but it was a start. At first, it was just simple questions. Which area are you assigned to today? Can you help me carry this to the truck? Questions that were strictly work-related, with no friendliness in her tone. But to Johnny, it was already a huge step forward. Then one day she approached him while he was carefully bandaging an injured animal. "Why are you still here?" Johnny looked up. He could see the doubt in her eyes, but this time, she no longer seemed as distant. He carefully set down the bandages, thinking for a moment before answering. "Because for the first time in my life, I want to do something that isn't about winning." Evelyn remained silent. Johnny didn't expect her to forgive him immediately. He didn't expect her to take him back after just a few words, but he hoped that she would understand, that he had truly changed, that he stayed not to win her back, but because he knew he belonged here. Evelyn said nothing, just gave a slight nod before walking away. But for the first time, Johnny felt that maybe he still had a chance. The rescue center remained as busy as ever, but Johnny could feel that something was slowly changing. He was no longer an outsider. Those who once doubted his presence had begun to recognize his genuine efforts. Evelyn, too, was no longer as distant as before. She no longer avoided him, no longer quietly turned away when he entered a room. Though she never said it, Johnny could sense a subtle acknowledgement from her. But that didn't mean everything had completely changed. She was still cautious, still maintained a certain distance. And that made Johnny realize that if he truly wanted to prove himself, he had to do much more. Derek showed up one afternoon, holding an envelope. "Do you know what this is?" Derek placed the envelope on the table, crossing his arms as he looked at Johnny. Johnny glanced at it but made no move to pick it up. "An invitation to the biggest race of the year," Derek smirked. "The one you've dreamed about your whole life." Johnny stared at the envelope. Once upon a time, just hearing about this race would have set his heart racing with excitement. But now all he felt was emptiness. "So are you going to join or not?" Derek asked, his gaze scrutinizing. Johnny didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to look at the rescue center's courtyard, where Evelyn was tending to an injured animal. A year ago, he wouldn't have hesitated to jump into this race, but now he knew he couldn't. Johnny picked up the envelope, looked at it one last time, then tore it in half. Derek's eyes widened. "Are you insane?" Johnny simply smiled. "I've found something more important." He stood up, walking out of the cafe where they had been sitting, leaving Derek behind with an expression of utter disbelief. Evelyn stood on the steps when Johnny returned. She had seen everything. "You gave up that race?" Johnny nodded. "It doesn't mean anything to me anymore." Evelyn looked at him for a long time, and for the first time, Johnny saw that her eyes no longer held the same guarded walls. Maybe this was the moment he had been waiting for all along. A year had passed since Johnny first stepped into the rescue center. No more games, no more bets. He and Evelyn had been through so much together. It wasn't a perfect love story. There were no dramatic, movie-like romantic gestures. Instead, there were long days of exhaustion, honest conversations, arguments, and moments of understanding. Johnny had never imagined he could change this much. Before, all he cared about was winning. Now he cared about the fragile lives he helped save each day. He cared about the way Evelyn smiled when she saw a life being rescued. And he cared about something he had never dared to admit before: real love. He didn't know when he had fallen in love with her. Maybe it was the first time she challenged him. Maybe it was the first time she looked at him without admiration. Maybe it was the moment he realized he wanted to stay, even if she wasn't there. But whenever it was, he knew one thing for certain: this was no longer a game. He loved her. One day, as Johnny was repairing an enclosure, Evelyn suddenly stood beside him. "How long do you plan on staying here?" Johnny wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking at her for a long moment before smiling. "For a lifetime." Evelyn didn't respond, but in her eyes, for the first time, there was a spark, one that Johnny had been waiting for all along. Johnny once thought love was a game, a conquest, a victory. But he had been wrong. Love wasn't a race. It wasn't something that could be won through strategy or planning. It was a journey of change and growth. If someone had told him a year ago that he would give up racing to work at an animal rescue center, he would have laughed. But now he no longer thought that way, because he had learned the most important lesson of his life. Sometimes the most meaningful thing isn't winning. It's finding where your heart truly belongs. And for Johnny, that place was here. It was Evelyn. It was a love he never thought he would find.